I wonder, have you ever noticed how almost every generation of people tends to take a little bit of pride in thinking about and talking about the ways that their generation had it tougher than the ones who came later, right? Like, it seems like almost every generation does this. You know, if you're a boomer, you might talk about how the Gen X kids had it easier. Or if you're a Gen X kid, you might talk about how the millennials had it easier. I'm a Gen X kid who grew up in the 80s, and nowadays I see people posting these memes on social media and talking about how when they grew up in the era that I did, that there were challenges and dangers that we faced that younger people didn't face. You know, they'll talk about things like we just ran around outside all the time barefoot and drank out of the water hose, and they'll talk about how we rode bikes and didn't have bike helmets and stuff like that. And the boomers are like, please, like, that sounds like nothing, you know, because the boomers are telling stories about how they drove cross country, like laying in the back dashboard of their parents' car, you know, or like standing in the front seat or something like that. And then they went to school and the school nurse gave them shots. Like, everybody just had to get shots at school. You know, that doesn't happen anymore. But that kind of stuff happened back then. And if you listen to people from the generation before yours, they'll almost always talk about how it was more challenging for them. You've probably heard that stereotypical idea of the elderly folks talking about how they had to walk uphill to school. It was uphill both ways, and snow, you know, up above their heads and all that kind of thing. And when people point out these generational differences, they're usually trying to imply, usually trying to make some cynical or sarcastic point about how later generations aren't as tough, or about how later generations don't realize how easy they've got it. But there's this hidden truth that's underneath all of that, that if in fact the next generation has it easier, it's because their parents made it easier for them, right? In many ways. It's because their parents helped to pave the way. And I want to tell you, I think that's a beautiful thing. I think every good parent, every good grandparent wants the next generation to have it better. Every good parent and grandparent wants the next generation to have it easier than we did. It's loving to try to protect our kids. It's loving to try to provide for them in ways that didn't happen for us. And one of the ways we try to protect our kids, one of the ways we try to shelter, and keep our kids safe is by being mindful of exposing them to some of the scary stories of things that happen in the world. Like in my house, we're cautious about who's in the room when the evening news is on, because there's scary things happening, and the kids are going to find out soon enough about all the wars and the abuses and the threats and the problems that the world is constantly facing. But for now, every loving parent that I know wants to protect their kids from hearing too much of the scary stuff on the news. We think to ourselves, let the kids be kids as long as they can. But some of the scariest stories come not from the news, but from the pages of the Scripture that we use to teach them about God. Some of the most terrifying narratives out there are found in the pages of this library of books that we hand to our kids, like for kindergarten, just as they're starting to read. This summer, I'm working my way through a series of sermons with us here called Flannel Graph Favorites. A flannel graph was just this old, visual aid that Bible class teachers used to use 40 years ago or something like that. But we're re-examining some of the Old Testament stories that I and many of you learned in Sunday school when we were children, and today we're opening up one of the most disturbing stories in all of Scripture. We're looking at the story when Abraham, the father of this faith that we're all gathered around, Abraham is asked to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice, a burnt offering to God. I remember learning this story as a kid. When we were in Sunday school, we had these they weren't animated, but they were illustrated picture Bibles. And they were kind of a large format thing, you open it up almost like a coffee table book kind of size. And they had multiple graphics on each page, kind of like a comic series or something, but they were full colored, fully illustrated. And I remember what this story looked like. I remember some of the scary scenes that I saw when my teacher was teaching me about this story of Abraham being asked to sacrifice Isaac. And this is a story that I'm a little surprised my teachers didn't skip over. It's one of those stories that I think to myself, for teaching the elementary school kids, this could be pretty traumatic. This could be pretty frightening for some of them to hear. I mean, put yourself in Isaac's shoes, this young man. Put yourself in his shoes, and it's a story of a helpless kid whose dad decides to kill him in the name of religion. And you can see how that would put all sorts of frightening ideas in a child's mind. Church kids might read this story and think, well, my parents take their faith seriously too. I wonder if God will ever ask my parents to do something scary like this. So this is a scary story for kids, but honestly, it's a scary story for adults too. It's one of those stories that's pretty disturbing for adults. In fact, lots of adults who have engaged this story and given it a lot of thought have come away feeling like this thing doesn't fit, this thing doesn't belong. Emily Dickinson was a famous poet that you might recognize, and she spent a lot of time engaging with this one particular story out of Genesis, and when she studied it, she decided that if this story's true, God must be a bully. God must be someone who's obsessed with power and prone to tyranny. That was her interpretation of this story. And then Soren Kierkegaard was this famous 19th century Christian philosopher, and even though he believed in the God of the Bible, he read this story and he thought, if that story's true, then God must be just inconsistent and arbitrary and unreliable. In fact, many Bible students have approached this story and found it so off-putting that they wish they could just ignore it. I've got one preacher friend who refuses to preach this story, just doesn't want to touch it, doesn't want to mess with it. But the church for centuries has found this story to contain evidence of the gospel. For centuries, Christians have discovered in this story the precursor of the good news about God's love for the world. And so our challenge, as we engage this story, our challenge is for us to look at it long enough and to look at it intently enough to see past the parts that are scary, to see past the parts that are off-putting, to see past the parts that are offensive so that we can see the heart of God that this story is meant to teach us about. I want to invite you to open your Bible to Genesis chapter 22, which is where this story happens. If you've got your phone, you can use the Bible app, or even the Heritage app has a link that'll take you directly to Genesis chapter 22. But when we get to this chapter, this is the 11th chapter of the narrative of Abraham's life. This guy used to be named Abram, and then God changed his name, but he was a man who was called by God to a special partnership. In fact, back in Genesis chapter 12, God invited Abram at that time, said, I'm inviting you to leave everything you know, to leave the family that you know, to leave the place where you were raised, to leave all of the security and the safety and the comfort of the place that you've been, where you've been born and bred. And God says, I'm inviting you to go to this mysterious place that I'm going to show you. And Abraham says yes. Without any background with God, without any history, without any stories, certainly not with any kind of narrative like we have, Abraham just says, I'll do it. And uproots his entire family, his household, follows God's invitation because God promised that he was going to bless Abraham and bless Abraham's children and bless all the other families of the world through Abraham's family. But you got to remember, Abraham didn't have any foreknowledge of God. Like he's just meeting God for the first time. Doesn't know anything about God's history. Doesn't know anything about God's ability. Doesn't know anything about God's character. And so, as we saw in last week's story, there are moments when Abraham makes dumb decisions, selfish decisions, questionable decisions, because he's trying to save himself, because he's just not sure if he can trust that God could save him instead. But over these last 10 chapters, since Genesis chapter 12, over these last 10 chapters, Genesis tells us about 6 different times where God and Abraham have a conversation. 6 different times where there's an interaction between God and Abraham, and over time, God is earning Abraham's trust. Over the course of these years, and this 10 chapters covers like a 30-year timeline, but over the course of this time, God is assuring Abraham of the blessed future that he has planned for Abraham. And the most dramatic proof, the most dramatic event and promise that happens in that time span is that Abraham, at 100 years old, finally becomes a father to his son Isaac. The son that God had been promising. The son that God said, it's through this young boy, through his lineage, that I'm going to bless the whole world. And that's why Genesis 22 gets especially disturbing. Because beginning in verse 1, we're told that sometime later, after Isaac was born, God tested Abraham. After all these years and all this connection and all these experiences together, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, here I am, Abraham replied. And then God said, take your son, and Abraham immediately knows who we're talking about. But God gets more like really leans in. Take your son, your only son, the one that you love. And in case I wasn't specific enough, Isaac. Take your son, your only son, the one that you love. Take Isaac and go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. And this is a horrible request. This is a horrible test. It's a horrible idea, and we can only imagine that Abraham wished that he had heard wrong or that he hadn't heard that at all. But this passage gives no indication that Abraham hesitated or resisted or pretended he didn't hear or asked for clarification. In fact, it doesn't even mention any objection or any questioning. It just says that early the next morning, first thing when the sun came up, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey, and he took with him 2 of his servants and his son, his only son, the one that he loved, Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about, as if there was no hesitation. It didn't even dawn on him to pause or to ask questions. There was no second guessing. There was no waiting to see if God would choose somebody else or change his mind or clarify. Abraham's response was like a reflex. He listened to God's call. Here I am, he said, and then he set his mind to do whatever God asked him to do. And I've heard a lot of sermons about this story. I've even seen some filmmakers try to depict what this moment might have looked like, and all of them try to speculate about how Abraham would have been grieved and would have been emotional and would have been hesitant and how difficult this would have been for him. And maybe they were right, but they even imagine how hard it was for Abraham to explain things to Sarah, to have conversation with his wife about this that morning, and the conversations that he would have with Isaac as they were traveling. And of course they would imagine that. I mean, isn't that how we would respond? We'd be fretting, we'd be crying, we'd be grieving the whole way. But Abraham's story doesn't include any of that. All we're told is that Abraham got started doing exactly what was asked of him. No hesitation. God asked, and Abraham answered. And verse 4 says, on the 3rd day of their travel, it took them a while to get there. It's about 45 miles. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance, the mount at Moriah. And he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship. Pay attention to this. He says, we will worship, and then we will come back to you. And I don't know if maybe he's just trying to throw the servants off the scent, like he doesn't want them to, be trying to stop him or think about what's about to happen. I don't know if maybe he's not trying to scare the boy, but he sounds confident. And this is like a clue for us. He sounds confident when he says, we will come back. We will be back here. And so Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on the back of his son Isaac. And this is one of the pictures out of my 4th grade picture Bible that I remember vividly. The picture of the young man carrying the wood that he's about to be executed on. He puts the wood for the burnt offering on his son Isaac, and Abraham himself carries the fire. I guess it's a torch of some kind, and he carries the knife. And as the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up, because Isaac's a pretty smart kid. Isaac says to his father, "Hey, Dad." "Yes, my son." "The fire and the wood are here, but isn't there something missing?" He says, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" See, Isaac's noticing we seem to have forgotten something back there, you know? Like something doesn't feel right. We didn't go through the checklist, but Abraham's not deterred. He's not distracted. He doesn't slow down. Abraham answers his son and says, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. And when they reached the place that God had told him about at Mount Moriah, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on the altar. And then he bound his son Isaac, tied him up, and laid him on top of the altar. Picture this scene. This man is probably 110, 115 years old, and he's tying up this young boy, and he's putting him on top of the wood. And then he reaches out his hand and he takes his knife to slay his son. And in our minds, we want somebody to step in and arrest this man or commit him or something. Now, if you've read the story, if you've heard this story before, then you're not panicked at this moment, because you know things are going to turn out okay. But if you're in Abraham's shoes at this moment, you don't have any idea what's about to happen. I mean, you think you know, and you don't like it. You realize the gravity of this situation because you're holding the knife, preparing to end the life that you've waited so long to see start. There's a lot at stake right here. This was the child that God had promised. This was the child of the covenant, the one through whom Abraham's family was supposed to grow and flourish. If Isaac dies, then the past 35 plus years of Abraham's life and relationship with God mean nothing, it would seem. But Abraham seems poised to go ahead with the command to kill his son when all of a sudden somebody does step in. In verse 11, the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied, which he says every time. And the angel of the Lord said, "Don't lay a hand on the boy. Don't do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son, the one that you love, Isaac." So in one of the most dramatic moments, one of the most dramatic scenes in all of Scripture, the angel of the Lord speaks up at just the precise instant when it had to happen, and says, "Stop, don't hurt him." But did you hear the reason? The reason that the angel gave, the angel says, "Now I know that you fear God, because you've not withheld from me your son." It wasn't because he got the instructions right, like going to the right mountain. It wasn't because he did everything right, building the altar so precisely. It was because he held nothing back. This was the moment when Abraham's partnership with God is confirmed. This is the moment when he demonstrated that he would trust God as much as God was putting trust in him. That he would trust God instead of his own intuition, instead of his own preferences, instead of his own solutions. And when he put his full trust in God, Abraham discovered that God didn't have any intention of taking Isaac away. That God wasn't going to let him kill the boy. Instead, God had arranged to provide everything that Abraham and Isaac needed. Verse 13 says, while Isaac is still laying there on top of the wood, laying there tied up, probably terrified, Abraham looks up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram that was caught by its horns. And he went over and he took the ram, took this goat, and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," which is kind of an adaptation, kind of a translation of the idea of what that would mean in Hebrew. The scholars I studied said if you were to really literally translate those words, it would sound something like, the Lord will see to it. The Lord will see to it. And in that place on Mount Moriah on that day, the Lord saw to it that Isaac was safe. The Lord saw to it that Abraham didn't have to sacrifice his child like all the civilizations around Canaan, like all of the groups and the kingdoms of people who sacrificed their children to their pagan gods. The Lord saw to it that that wasn't how Abraham had to connect with the God he was following. The Lord saw to it in that place. The Lord saw to it that Abraham had everything he needed, both for the present and for the future. And if you were to continue reading through the narrative of the story of God's people, and if you move past Abraham and his son and his grandson and his great-grandson and go forward a few generations, you would get to the story where a young king named Solomon built a temple for God. And he built it on Mount Moriah, on this high place where the Lord sees to it that his people have what they need. That temple would be the place where God's people for generations would offer their sacrifices for worship, but they never had to sacrifice their children like all the pagan civilizations around them. The Israelites sacrificed the gifts that God had given to them first. They sacrificed animals from their herds. They sacrificed crops from their fields. They sacrificed money from their earnings because God saw to it that they had everything that they would ever need. And then you keep reading through the narrative of God's people, and generations later, this traveling rabbi who was known as Jesus of Nazareth would allow himself to be arrested and tried and beaten and crucified. And it happened, guess where? On that high place where the temple was, on Mount Moriah. And after he died, his resurrection from the dead proved that he was in fact God in the flesh, and his power over death demonstrated once again that the Lord will see to it that those who trust him have what they need. Just a couple of weeks ago, we wrapped up a series in the New Testament book of Hebrews. And Hebrews tells some stories of some of these giants of the faith, people whose faith has inspired others following God for generations. And Hebrews mentions this Abraham story, this Genesis 22 story of it as an indicator of just how much faith Abraham had placed in God by that point. I want you to hear what Hebrews has to say in these couple of verses. Hebrews chapter 11 says, "By faith, Abraham offered Isaac when he was tested. The one who received the promises was offering his only son, the one that he loved, Isaac. He had been told concerning this son, your legitimate descendants will come through this kid." And then watch this last sentence in Hebrews. Abraham figured that God could even raise Isaac from the dead. That's what Abraham's faith was all about. He knew that God had promised that Isaac was going to have children. And so this act of sacrificing the boy didn't make any sense, but he believed that God knew what he was doing, even if Isaac had to be raised from the dead. So for Abraham, the most important priority was obeying God no matter what it cost him. God was not just a means to an end. For he wasn't just using God as a way to accumulate more or to feel more secure or to feel more safe or to have more power or influence or to have a son. Abraham had always wanted to have children, but that was not his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal became following God. And Isaac was God's gift to Abraham, but Abraham didn't let the gift become more important to him than the gift giver. And that's why he passed the test. He was willing to give back to God whatever God had entrusted to him. And when he lived with that kind of open-handedness, when he lived with that kind of trust, Abraham discovered that God will see to it, that those who trust him have what they need. And I wonder, I wonder what would change in our hearts if we had that level of confidence that God would see to it for us. If we had that level of confidence that seeking first God's kingdom and His righteousness would assure that God would see to it we have what we need. You know, this is one of those stories that I'm a little bit nervous about them teaching down the hall in the children's wing. I mean, I'm a little cautious about teaching this to young children because they could misunderstand, they could get scared, they could get frightened about all of the implications and all of the scary things in this story about child abuse and lack of control and agency and all of that. This is one of those stories I'm nervous about teaching to kids, but honestly, I'm kind of nervous about teaching it to you too. Because you could read this story and get distracted by all the front matter. You could read this story and get distracted by all the parts that are so offensive, that seem so hard to explain, and you would miss the heart of God at the end of the story, who never was going to let Isaac be harmed. You would miss the heart of God at the end of the story, who was going to see to it, like He does, that His people have what they need. And so my prayer for you as we wrap up this morning, my prayer for you is that as you reflect on this ancient story and all of its layers and all of its challenges, that as you reflect on this story, that you would be invited into an all-in relationship with God. That you would have a moment as you reflect on this story where God would reveal to you the parts of your life that are not available to God, that are not open to God's control. That as you reflect on this ancient story, that maybe for the first time you would recognize some area of your life where you think, boy, that would be hard for me to let go of the reins and let God take the lead. Because when you discover that possession, that relationship, that fear, that area of influence in your life, that's your Isaac. And until you decide that you're willing to hand that over, until you decide that trusting God with all of it is your goal, then your relationship with God will be stuck. It'll be stagnant. And you'll be fearful. And you'll be inclined to make decisions based on your own wisdom and your own well-being and your own anxiety, like Abraham did in those previous chapters we talked about last week. You'll lead with fear. You'll live with fear until you come to the place that you realize that we serve a God who will see to it that the ones who trust Him have what they need.